Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever, middle of the night for some of you. Happy Monday. It's Happy Monday. It's Monday today. Cool. And I'm in desperate need of a haircut for those of you that haven't noticed, so we're going to get that sorted this week. So hello everyone who is in, where are we? London, Australia. People in Australia. It's late in Australia, Alan. UK, Jerusalem. Jerry's in the quail nursery. You know, I need to explain that one, Jerry. That's a new one. Roger's in the US, Netherlands, where else? Singapore, Abu Dhabi, Malaysia. Cool. We're all over the place today. Okay. So, welcome, everyone. Today's editing session, we're going to go through probably 5 or 6 images. In the Facebook group that some of you are members of, you'll have seen I put out a request for some city ones, just because we were getting into this sort of place of editing a lot of landscape stuff. So I tried to try and mix that up a little bit. Let's try and get some cities involved, and those cities we're going to focus on in the second half of this morning rather than the first, or this afternoon. Sorry for most of you. So let's just get started on the normal ground rules. So remember, everything that you type on the screen, I have about a 15-second delay. That's just the way that YouTube and Facebook and so on work. If anyone has a problem with sound or with video and stuff, put a comment up. We'll try and fix that. Failing that, then we'll just carry on. But remember, always put in questions as we go. Don't be afraid to ask a question. Those questions are really useful because sometimes it's something that someone else wants to know as well. We'll put it up and we'll try and discuss it. But remember, there's a little bit of a delay, so don't worry. We'll go back if we need to, if it's relevant. So Jerry, we've got a Gamble's quail family in our backyard in South Arizona. Jerry, you never fail to surprise me. I think actually maybe we have one of Jerry's images today. I'm not sure. We'll have a look. Okay, so getting started then in Capture One, we are on version 13.1.1, which is the version that most of you should be using if you are using version 20. If you're not using version 20, then just bear in mind that there are upgrades available and so on at the moment, so it's worth having a little play with. In terms of some of those prices are coming down at the moment. There's also some discounts at the moment on brand new licenses. So if you're not using version 20, have a look at what the options are and move up to it. And of course, if you haven't used the Capture One before, then download the free trial. It's completely free. It works for 30 days and everything's good. Okay, so let's get into Capture One. There's some weird stuff going on today with some of those title screens. We'll try and fix that for next time. Sorry about that, a bit weird. Right, Capture One. So here is a picture by someone called Wayne. Now I know Wayne because I should have been out shooting in this exact location with this exact person this month, but unfortunately for obvious reasons, trips all got cancelled. So we had a bit of a challenge, but Wayne went out anyway and got this shot. This is actually in New Zealand. Really cool shot. It's hoarfrost over one of the lakes, and to be honest, out of the camera this shot is pretty cool. It's a GFX 50 shot, so it's nice and sharp. We've got loads and loads of detail in there. And all we're going to do is make a couple of small changes, really. Nothing massive in this. We're just going to make it feel a little bit more wintry and a little bit more detailed and structured. And you can probably guess how we're going to do that for those of you that have been on here for a while. So on all of these ones, just as before, the first step we're going to do with all of the images today is going to make sure the lens profile is loaded in. I've actually pre-loaded some of these lens profiles, so hopefully that speeds things up a little bit in terms of editing. But as a recap, best case scenario is you find the lens has loaded in automatically from the camera that you were using, the camera and lens combo. If not, then some cameras actually will embed the information, and that comes in what's called manufacturer profile. The manufacturer profile is pretty much as good as Phase 1's or Capture One's lens profiling, and it's going to bring in some automatic stuff around chromatic aberration and so on, and all the distortion values. If you don't have a specific lens identified, and you know it's that definite lens, so if you don't have it pop up automatically, but you know it's the lens that you use, then by all means choose it manually and dial it in. If you can't find your lens in this database, don't go for the nearest next best thing or whatever else. Stick to generic. The reason is because even though a lens may seem very similar, it's only version 2 versus version 1, things like diffraction change wildly between different versions. Aberration changes quite significantly. The sharpness fall off changes between lenses, especially as well if you're going from a, I've got a 100 to 400, one's a 5.6 and one's an f8, or one's with an extender. The character of that picture will change a lot. So don't go for the nearest option, go for generic. Generic is actually fine at doing most things. And if you really, really feel that you're missing a lens, go to support.capture1.com, put the request in. Enough people ask for a lens, the profile gets added. It's that simple. So this one has the manufacturer profile brought in. Because it's a manufacturer profile, and with Fuji, it then allows us access to all of the Fuji film simulations as well, which is kind of cool. So if we have a look without and with, for example, or let's go to classic chrome or even monochrome. So in my basic color tab here in the base characteristics, we've got our ICC profile, which is the one for that camera. But when you use a Fuji, modern Fuji camera with Capture One will actually mimic a lot of the Fuji film simulations that you have in your camera. Now, of course, if you've chosen one in your camera, Capture One will respect that and it'll bring that in as well. Which is why quite often if you choose monochrome in your camera, you bring it into Capture One expecting to see the raw image and it's still monochrome. And you think, uh-oh, I've lost all the color. No, you haven't. What you've got is the monochrome automatically selected, and you need to go into your base characteristics and under the curve, choose a different style, which could be linear response. We covered that in the last session, or the auto, which is what Capture One will do to try and create a curve that's quite vibrant and vivid. Now, in this case, the auto curve is pretty nice, but actually just looking through some of these, if you look at these trees here, specifically in the middle, in auto, it's actually a little bit flat. Now, it's going to be flat because of the frost, but actually getting some contrast in there would be really good. So if I go from auto, for example, there to, let's say, high contrast here, you see that pop that you're getting? So we really want to keep the frost. We really want to keep the dusting that's going on everywhere. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the image is quite vibrant and vivid and nice to look at. So having that high contrast option actually adds something to this image, in my view. But there's also another one in here, which is the Fujifilm Pro Neg High. So you've got standard, which is actually pretty flat. It's actually flatter than the auto from Capture One. But this high version, if I go without, so that's the auto, and that's with, to me, that adds something to it. It's got an extra bit of depth, and it's just that contrast. It's the extra darks and the shadows that's just adding a little bit more depth. So for me, it's between this one and potentially film high contrast. And actually, I'm sort of leaning towards the film high contrast out of the two of them, but the Fuji one's just as good as well. So that's selected. So this is sort of with a Fuji camera, specifically with those film simulations that are built in to Fuji's system and relationship with Capture One. You can use that a lot. There are some with Nikon cameras as well. The film simulations, these extra shadow, high contrast, standard, and linear response, are directly out of Capture One. So you don't need a Fuji camera to do that. You can choose the other film simulations anyway. But for now, we're going to stick with that high contrast one. Okay, next up. White balance. So this is about the feel of the image. Now, in terms of white balance, let's have a little look at let's think about how this image should feel. It's frosty, it's wintry, it's July in New Zealand, that's winter. It should feel cold. And at the moment, the auto white balance that's come out of the camera, it's really, really nice. It's a subtle, it's slightly warming, but it's a subtle sort of beigey color. I want to cool that down just a little bit. Now, again, I wasn't there at the point that this was captured, so I can't say for sure whether or not that feels correct. But if I cool it down a little bit, and let's just take that down to there, and I'm going to just adjust the tint so we don't have that green color that sort of starts to creep in as we cool down the Kelvin. Let's just pull that Kelvin up a little bit there. That works. Okay, if I now look at the before and after, and we go from here to here, this one just feels so much more wintry. It just feels cold. When you look at it, it's sort of cold. The video, Raymond's just said the video keeps going out of focus. On the screen or on me? Weird. Okay, it shouldn't do. I'm here. Okay, let's have a play with it, and hopefully it gets better. Okay, so with the cool temperature of this print, this allows us to make it feel like winter the second you touch it. rather than here, it looks really calm, it looks nice and low contrast, it looks nice and serene. We still have that same feeling of calm, it's just colder. So white balance is so important in terms of these shots, especially when it comes to trying to replicate a season effectively. Okay, so with our white balance done, let's have a little play at, let's have a look. Let me just turn off our before. Okay, so Raymond's just said that both the screen and me go out of focus. I have a feeling that's not out of focus. I have a feeling it may be your stream being interrupted, Raymond. So if anyone else has got a problem with focus, let me know. If the screen's going a bit weird and blurry, let me know. But hopefully it's just at one end where it's losing maybe some bandwidth or something like that. But for here, it looks okay. Okay, so next up, now we've done that feeling, let's have a look at the crop. So that crop, I'm going to choose a crop here, and I'm not even going to think about it, go to 1:2. This up the top here isn't adding anything. It is showing that it's pretty, it is pretty clear, pretty clean, pretty low contrast. Obviously it was foggy. Same here, it was foggy as well. But we don't need this to tell us that. All of the information about fog and frost and so on is in the middle part. So let's get rid, basically, and let's just cut this right down to 1:2. Now, rather handily, in photographic terms, remember rule of thirds and all the other stuff. So from that point of view, we've got a nice third line here. So if I look at my grid, well, we've got 1/3 here, which is this sort of white dusted bush here. We've got a lovely dark sort of forest in the middle, and then we've got the slightly more sparse bit on the left-hand side. We could, if we wanted to, really be strict about it and say, well, actually, now we're into thirds. But I'm not sure that this tree out on the right hand side loses anything. If anything, it adds a little bit of depth, so I'm going to leave that in. So it's not quite, but it's pretty neat there. Do not be afraid of having a panoramic image where your subject is along the middle. There's this whole thing in photography about everything's got to be on a third line. Yes, obviously, actually, we're using the third lines here. We're saying that this mountain here is on a third, and that gives us a nice, pleasant image to look at. But don't fall into this trap of, well, therefore my horizon also needs to be on a third. If I do that, honestly, it just looks stupid. Why have we added all of this extra boring information at the top when we've deleted some of the reflection? That doesn't make sense. So don't be afraid of going smack bang in the middle as long as the composition feels right. And this is all about when to break the rules and when not to. Okay, so the Rogers actually just said, I see some white-blue color separation around the top of the hill. Is it cloud or overexposure clipping? This is actually cloud. If I turn on my exposure warning, there's nothing here. And even if I look in the histogram, if you look up here on the left-hand side, as I'm moving around up here, you can see I'm not even touching anywhere near the end of the histogram. That orange line is showing me where we are on the histogram. And there's nothing anywhere near up here. And actually, we're going to push it even more in a minute with levels. So to me, we might have a little play with clarity up on the top, and we'll do that in a second, and we'll hopefully try and bring some of that texture back, but we have to assume that we've probably lost most of the detail. So on the stream, I think we've sort of found out, as David's just said, yeah, it may be that you're viewing it not with the HD option, or Facebook, I know, really compresses the stream, so you might be better off switching onto YouTube. Cool, okay, so we know that we've got a histogram which is relatively low contrast. How do we know that? Because there's nothing up here in the highlights, there's nothing down here in the shadows, and it's all sort of fitting. It's not quite as pyramidy as we had last Friday, or I think it was Friday, but it's certainly not exactly stretching the whole width of the histogram. So what we can do is pull our levels in. And remember, levels allows us to say to the histogram, the data that is here, I want to push up here, and the data that is here, I want to push down there. So it's taking all the data that's in the middle, that's not quite at the edges, and it's pulling it out towards the edge. So pulling stuff that's almost bright to completely bright and almost dark to completely dark. That's different to exposure. Exposure slides the histogram right and left. Prasad's just asked, can we try the white balance picker on the tree to see the difference? Absolutely, yes we can. So white balance picker, I've dialed in the white balance manually, obviously using those two sliders here. We can choose this picker instead. And let's look at a tree that is, I guess, covered in frost. Let's have a look there. I'm going to get some weird effects here. We've got some weird, oh, that's my exposure warning. So it's gone warmer for sure. And the reason it's gone warmer is because that white isn't pure white. And this is where I'm saying it depends on your interpretation of it. From your perspective, and this is down to you taking the photo. If you remember this being warmer, then have the white balance warmer. If you remember it being colder, then have the white balance colder. However, to me, if I'm looking at this as just a picture that I'm going to walk into a room and see on a wall, I want it to feel cold, because I wasn't there when I took this picture. So it comes into a different discussion around how does a print feel versus how does a photograph of your memory feel, and how do you remember? Okay. Good news. Raymond has fixed the problem by changing the browser from Firefox to Chrome. Yep, that'll do it. I, you must be the only person I've heard recently that uses Firefox. Wow, I didn't realize it was still around. But yeah, Chrome would help for sure, but it may also be a stream thing. Not quite sure what was going on there. Okay. So with that cold, and again, it's personal preference. I've got this cold. Let's now play with those levels. So we're going to stretch the stuff that was here in the almost bright all the way up to being nice and bright. If I turn my exposure warning on, I'm making sure there's nothing that's actually overexposed. If I pull this down too much, there we go. There's our warning, and it's saying, whoa, this stuff is beyond 255. Remember, it's beyond 255 in one or more of the RGB channels. It doesn't have to be all of them. If any one of them hits 255, and in this case it's blue, then it's going to give you a warning. But we don't want that. We don't want an exposure warning. But I do want to just make this pop a little bit. So I'm going to pull that down, 222. So effectively, this number here, 222, is now mapped to 255. So if something was a value of 222 originally, it's now pushed up to 255. And we're going to do the same with the shadows. So now something that was 6 or 7, maybe 7, that's now pushed down to be in the shadows in the blacks. Okay, so effectively that's what we want to see in our levels if we're doing it with levels. With curves, we put in a little bit of an S shape potentially, but for me on this one, the data in the middle is nicely laid out anyway. I don't really want to push it too much. Okay, so that's our levels done. So we've got a histogram that's now a little more expanded. So we've got some real nice highlights and some deep shadows as well. And we can see that in these frosted trees. Let's just go and look at these trees themselves. Now, being unfair, we're at 300% here, which is particularly unfair. At 300%, we've obviously got some pixelation, but I'm also looking at whether I can see the texture in the trees. So remember, clarity and structure can fix, let's call it micro contrast, especially in midtones, but it fixes micro contrasts on areas for clarity or on textures and details for structure. Areas is just going to make this thing pop but look weird. If I do that, it just looks overdone. It just looks too contrasty. It's wrong. But in here, my structure is going to pull out all that texture in these trees and all that frost. So I don't want to use too much structure. If you do it too much, you're going to end up with a load of halos and margins around the areas. But let's just go dial in maybe, I don't know, 14 or 15, something like that. If I do a before and to after, you can see how much of a difference that makes, especially with all this stuff that's intricate. So those of you shooting with a high resolution camera, so 50 megapixels and above, structure can really help bring out some of those details, especially in branches and leaves and all that sort of stuff when you come to editing. Don't overdo it. If you overdo it, you end up with halos and it just looks over sharp, and over sharp sort of hurts to look at. But it certainly helps, especially when we're in here. If I go into 100%, I've now got a lot more detail in there. Might even dial it back even from there, just to about there. Okay. We said we'd play with clarity up in the sky, so let's put a gradient mask on very quickly. And I want it to finish by the time it gets to the trees, so we'll pull it down to there. With that gradient mask, I'm going to pull up clarity to see what we get. Okay, so we get a bit of a boost. If I turn this off there and on, you can see we end up with this sort of cloud detail here and a little bit of brightness over that hill. It probably helps a little bit. It's not exactly fundamental to the change that we're doing to the image, but it probably enhances it just a touch, so you can see there's more texture there in the cloud than there was before. And then that's sort of it. Now let's go before and after. So all of those changes, if you think about it, they've all been very, very small. We've made a little adjustment to white balance, a little adjustment to tint, a little adjustment to structure, a little adjustment to the levels. Let's do before and after. So look how flat the before looks compared to the after. Now again, this is down to personal preference. So you may prefer the flattened version, the lower contrast version. It may feel more serene. If I wanted to go more serene and soft, then yes, a slightly warmer white balance, slightly less levels works. It's not quite so vivid and contrasty. If anything, we could reduce that here just a touch and there with our shadows. But to me, this is a wonderful picture. I love this picture. I'm quite annoyed that I didn't stand there next to him while he was taking it. However, if I want a wintry scene, this one just feels to me that instant feeling of, wow, that's cold. That's frost, and that's what we're looking for. So when we hang it on a wall, it just feels like winter immediately, rather than having to sort of interpret a little bit. Okay, so let's move on to a shot by Kaleem. Moving on then to this one, we've got a lovely, rather useful spotlight above, and I'm just going to, given that we've spent a couple of these sessions talking about the curves, the film curves, I'm just going to use that curve demonstration again here, so that you're all on the same page. So if I go into my lens, we've already loaded in, it's a manufacturer profile, it was f2.8, so I'm not going to bother with diffraction correction. There was a little bit of fringing on some of the high contrast points, which I've just removed in there. And now let's go to the color tab. So the color tab is where we'll find that base characteristics one. So this was an A7R2. And on our curve, you see, because we haven't got those film simulation profiles for this type of camera, we've got the standard ones from phase one, or capture one, sorry, which is film, extra shadow, film high contrast, film standard, and linear response. Now, I think we covered this in the last session, but I'm going to go into it again so people can get their head around it. This image has got some what seem like overblown highlights. In fact, if I go to our exposure warning, we can see them. They're overblown. So the first thing I'm going to end up doing with my auto curve is going into our exposure tab and probably pulling down our highlights and our white slider until we get rid of those exposure warnings. In fact, we might even want to pull the exposure down. But that's because we're starting off from the curve that Capture One has built in as auto. Okay. Damien's made it. Welcome. Oh, and Bruce. Hi, Damien. Hi, Bruce. Cool. You're online. So look at this exposure warning. And that's on the auto curve. Let's go back to our color tab up here, the three circles, and change the curve. So we're not changing any actual adjustment in the image. We're just changing the curve that Capture One applies to the histogram. And we'll change that to linear response. Now, let's have a look in this detail here. Auto. Linear response, auto, and then linear response. Let's go to our exposure warning. Oh, sorry, I didn't turn on the exposure warning, that will help. So, linear response, auto. You see there's not that much difference, but where there is difference, it's actually quite crucial when we turn off that warning. So it's not changing the exposure of the image, it's just changing how Capture One interprets this into our final image. So let's turn the warning off, and again, that's our linear response curve. Here's our auto curve. So I've got two choices. I can start with auto, because actually auto does a good job of making all these other colors look wonderful. Linear response looks a little flatter, but it means I don't have to recover so much. So it's basically a choice. If I start with linear response, I've got to add some contrast in where I want it. If I start with auto, it's probably done the contrast stuff correctly. It's probably done all of the making it look vivid and making it look vibrant and bright, but it's at risk of having those highlights really push up high and the shadows really push down low, and you end up then spending a lot of time recovering stuff that you could have started with in linear response. So in this case here, I'm going to switch to linear response because I don't want to spend time recovering something from that when I know all the details already there. The data's already there. We're just going to start from linear response instead. Good question, Michael. So what percentage of the time are you using linear response? Honestly, for my style of photography, not very often at all. The reason is because if I'm doing something high contrast, really high contrast, it's probably because I'm shooting a city or something with a lot of lights. And in the case of a city or something with a lot of lights, I want that contrast. I want the lights to be nice and bright. So auto actually helps me. And what I found is I'd end up spending so much time going from linear response to get it back to auto that if there was a couple of sort of overblown highlights or something like that, I'd just pull it back. In general terms, I've seen I would use linear response maybe 5 to 10% of times, if that. I know people that use it solely, so they immediately set their defaults, and you can. In here, I can say save these as defaults for this camera, and they set their default to linear response, and they always start from there. Nothing wrong with doing that. It's not a bad way of editing. It's actually a very, very good way of editing, but you're going to spend a lot of time doing stuff that Capture One could have started you off almost for the 80% rule to begin with. So it comes down to your style of photography. Personally, not very often, but every now and then, yeah, it helps rescue. So with our linear response curve in, let's have a look at what we're going to do with the image. First thing is I'm looking like that. That's not quite right. So let's try and fix this. It's not just the straighten tool. So the straighten tool's up here, and we can see if I draw a line across this line here. Okay, good. That's now straight. This is roughly straight as well, but the roof isn't. So if we think about why this is parallax, it's perspective distortion. So as I'm looking at this building, the far wall is disappearing off because I'm at an angle. And when I'm at an angle, it means that the wall or the ceiling and the floor seem to converge as they get further away from me. That's what keystoning is for. So the keystone tool up here next to the straighten tool, go to keystone horizontal. We're not worried about the straightness of it. We're just going to worry about the keystone of the building roof. So remember, this was already straight, yeah, because we already used the straighten tool on it. So I'm not going to bother changing these bottom ones here because I know they're roughly straight. And if I look at this line along here of this tile, that's pretty good. It might come down a touch, but that's about it. The important one is this one along the top here. And let's assume that this line along this roof is straight. I'm going to draw that, follow it along, and hit apply. When I do that, this is different to straightening. So straightening takes your canvas and it rotates. That's all it does. It just rotates. And you've got the auto function to do it vertically or horizontally, but it's just going to rotate the whole canvas. Keystone, if you have a look, this triangular area that appears along here on the outside, well, that's where it's warped and effectively pulled and stretched the perspective on the picture. So keystoning helps us get the images and the buildings straight. Where you've got perspective distortion. So let's hit the arrow key, and now we can see it straight. Now, as a result, we lose some of the area around the picture through cropping, because we have to, because it's had to pull some of the building. But I don't think we're losing much, actually. In here, it looks pretty good, and from a compositional point of view, actually, it's pretty nice. I might go to the crop tool and set it across here a little bit. So we're still on, the magic 1/3 line. Let's go back to that one again. And we've got this nice lead in here from the right-hand side, which is great. With these two, let's have a look. So remember, we didn't blow much out, but where we have got a couple of highlight blowouts here, I'm just going to pull them down, and the whites just a touch, just to try and recover those a bit as well. So remember, whites is a subset of the highlights area, which is all of this area up here in the histogram, and whites being this bit. Blacks is a subset, so this bit of all of the shadow area of the histogram as well. So shadows also affects black, highlights also affects white. Black doesn't necessarily affect all of the shadows, just that subset, and white only affects a subset of highlights as well. So with that done, what I'm not going to do here, so you can see here actually there's a little hint, and this is one of the problems. We've got stuff here in this picture which is very, very, very low in the shadow range. It's actually almost off the scale in some ways. We've also got this tiny little lump here, which is right up there in the whites and the highlights. And that's these bits here that we're showing as overexposed. We've still got a little bit of an exposure warning there. Like I said earlier, the exposure warning is going to show when any of the RGB channels goes to 255. So look at those numbers at the top up here. We can see on her arm 195 in red, 255 in green, 255 in blue, so it shows as overexposed. But even down here, look, 159 in red, that's not overexposed in the red channel. 222 in green, that's not overexposed either. 255 in blue is overexposed. So it's going to warn you if any of them are overexposed. If I go into that area, nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly fine. It's not blown out, but just keep an eye on that exposure warning because it's telling you there might be something that's just going to tip over the edge. Okay, Michael's just said, where are we? Has Capture One looked into an auto keystone setting? So Yes, and there is one if you own a Phase 1 camera. So when I load my pictures into Capture One, I can click on the auto button in Keystone, and because my digital back actually has a, oh, what do they call it? It's not spirit level, it's a clever thingy. Complete brain fry. But the camera actually remembers its orientation at the point that you captured, and therefore Capture One reads that and it can auto keystone. Whether they're going to do it for all cameras in the future without that data, I am not sure. I don't know officially. So in terms of what's coming down the line, it may well do, it may not, but certainly it's a question that a lot of people have asked for. What I would say, Michael, is if you want it, go to support.capture1.com, lodge it as a feature request, because the more people that ask for it, the higher up the list it goes. It's that simple. Okay, Dan's just said, when I use the crop tool to change to say 4x5, it defaults to vertical frame rather than horizontal. How do I change that? Well, so if I change this to, let's do 4x5, and you're talking about that, so it's now gone vertical. I don't know why it would have automatically done that. It shouldn't do, because it should take the orientation based on, so if you had a landscape orientation, oh sorry, a portrait orientation picture, and you want to do a landscape 4x5, it would default to whatever orientation the pure or raw picture is. To override it, so as I move this, yes, you're right, it sticks to vertical. It's going to sound weird to say, you've got to pull that thing down. So you just literally force it. So this way is going to go up and down vertically. That way, if I push the mouse out to the right or push it out to the left, it's going to force that diagonal to go a little bit wider, and force the ratio to go landscape rather than portrait effectively. But you've just got to push it. Mr. Grover is online. Thank you, Mr. Grover. It's called an angular velocity sensor, and you wonder why I can't remember. Let's call it a little spirit level, but we'll go for that. So, yes, there is an angular velocity sensor inside the Phase 1 digital backs, which is great, and it means that auto keystoning works, but it does mean that for other cameras you have to dial it in manually at the moment. Okay, so with our crop, yeah, absolutely. So it's going to read in whatever orientation your picture is, but if you want to change that orientation, just switch back to original. So I could force this vertical by pushing it. It sounds stupid, but when I do it, my head almost goes with my hand. You sort of push it to be vertical, and if I want it to go landscape, I sort of pull it, and it goes landscape as long as I'm pulling it. Okay, you're all going to be doing that as you do your crops from now on. It's a bit weird. So let's take from there and let's get back to our crop here. So Damien's saying, oh, interesting, it's happened to me as well. 4x4 default, 4x5 defaults to vertical even for landscape pictures. You can push it. It's weird because on here, so let me just show you. If I switch this to 4x5 and start cropping, that's the correct landscape crop. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Because I'd have to push it to be vertical. So I'm not exactly sure, unless you'd already rotated it or something. I don't know. We can have a look at it. I'll try and break one at some point into 4x5, and we'll see if we can get to the bottom of it. Okay, crop set. In this one, I want the focus to be on these guys. I'm just conscious we've talked a lot about crop and the crop tool. So on these guys here, I'm just going to create a quick radial mask. So remember, with the gradient masks, if there isn't already a gradient layer up here, it's going to create one the second I start drawing. Click in the center, drag it out, drag it up, and I want to cover these two here. You can see there it says adjustment layer number 1. It's created that automatically for us. And if I turn my mask on, you can see what that's done. So I press M on the keyboard to turn the mask on or off. And I'm going to make this really soft. So the softness of a mask, the transition of the gradient mask, and this is the same with linear as it is with radial, depends on the distance between these three lines. So this is our 50% point, this is our 100% point, so anything beyond that is 100% effect. And this is our 0% point, so anything down here is 0% effect. The bigger the distance between this line and this line, the softer the mask is going to be. And the softer the mask is, the less obvious it's going to look in your picture that you've added a gradient mask into it. We could do this with vignetting, but remember, vignetting is effectively just a radial mask, but it's always in the center. It can be elliptical or it can be circular, but it's always going to be in the center. We want to offset it. We want it to be up here on the 1/3 mark. So I'm going to turn off our mask. And because we know that the outside has been masked, that was the red area, with the outside, I can pull down our exposure. And now we add some drama, which is kind of cool. With this guy here, there's a person sat in the shadows here. I want to pull him up a little bit, but I don't want this obvious sort of exposure mask. So let me show you. If I create a new mask in here, what I don't want to do really is erase from the mask. So if you bear in mind, I've pulled in our exposure here. I'm not going to use exposure to bring him up. I'm going to use shadows to bring him up because I don't necessarily want to pull up over the lights and everything as well. So I'm going to draw a separate layer. So this one is going to be called vignette. This one is going to be called dude in background because I'm not sure of his name. And with this, I'm just going to turn my mask on. Really, really low opacity, because that's the way I do it. And I'm just going to pull a little bit of him up in this background here. So by continually picking on him and drawing on it, we increase the opacity with every single time I click the brush button. And then with our shadows, I'm just going to pull that up just a touch because I don't want him lost into that darkness. I want him to be there as part of the picture. And now I can just add on a little bit more if I want some other stuff included. And I can switch to my eraser tool, this one here, and I can erase bits like this bottom plinth that I don't want in the mask anymore. So sometimes you need to be able to see the effect to work out what you want to do with that mask. It's very subtle, this, but it just goes from that to that just so we can see him a little bit clearer. And then all the focus is on these guys. So if I now look at, I'm going to create a clone of that variant and just reset. So there's our original, and there's our final. Now with this one overall, what I could afford to do now is pull up our brightness. Now why brightness rather than exposure? Some of you will know this. So we've got this covered in one of the pro tips videos that are on YouTube about brightness and exposure. Have a look at it because to a lot of people, they don't understand the difference between those two. Oh, it's a very loud motorbike going by, sorry. The difference between brightness and exposure. Exposure takes your histogram and it literally slides it from right to left, so it can push stuff off the edge very, very easily. Brightness squashes. So it squashes stuff down to the shadows or it squashes it up to the highlights. And it's a little more protective of highlights being overexposed. So if I pull the brightness up on this picture, remember we have those highlight warnings here. That's going to be safer than pulling up exposure. If I pulled up exposure, just reset that. You see these highlights here? Are starting to they're starting to burn, they're starting to overexpose. If I pull up the brightness slider though, it protects them a little bit more, and that's what we're trying to do here. But that's at least it's given us a little bit more punch in the picture, and it's a little bit more obvious. So sometimes as well, remember, it can be worth going back to the original picture to make sure we haven't strayed too far away from what was there. But to me, from there to there, that's a pretty good look. We might want to change our white balance, but actually the way that it's shot's pretty nice. We could warm it a touch, go a little bit warmer there, but that looks pretty good. Okay, so June's just asked, I have a Phase 1 digital back for my Mamiya. Where can I get tutorials for the Phase 1 digital back? Digital back will be with your dealer, June, so I'm not sure what digital back you've got, but certainly go on to phase1.com. They've got all the instructions and manuals and everything up there. The dealer can help you as well if necessary. For Capture 120, this is a good place to start. Failing that, you've got, learn.capture1.com. There's a load of tutorials that I know David Grover's put up there, their own YouTube channel and stuff like that. It's all covered on there. Pretty much anything you want to know, if you search for it, you'll find it. And in these sessions, we'll try and cover some specific stuff too. Okay, so 2 pictures in 37 minutes. That's not great record so far. We'll get to the cityscapes, I promise. So this one from Edwin. This one, yeah, you posted this on Facebook. I remember this one. So sun streets coming through the forest. How do we make that a little bit better? How do we make it look a little more exciting? Well, this is a DNG, so a digital negative file, which means it's probably been processed at some point by something on the way in. We could load in some of these. We've got a high contrast option, which might be worth playing with. Look at what linear response has done. So do you remember I said about that curve? Linear response is great at recovering stuff, but you lose a lot of contrast. Look at how much contrast we lose by putting in linear response. So if I wanted to spend my time pulling out strands of light, I could do that, but actually you're better off, in fact in this case I would go for a high contrast one to start with, or auto. Auto is pretty good. Let's have a little look. I am going to stick with auto, I think. Okay, so we've got our image, we've got these strands of light that we want to focus on. First off, let's make the light feel like it's probably where it was, which is down low a little bit, so probably a lot warmer than that. Let's just bring that in to feel a little more sunsetty or sunrisey. I'm just going to adjust that tint to suit so we keep it nice and warm. Okay, so with that, now we've got a challenge. So, and actually, funny enough, I was talking to someone about this the other day, about light streaks and strands coming through a forest. And the reason was they were asking why Luma range wouldn't work on light streaks. Well, let's think about what the light streaks actually sit on. Let me just move my mouse to a pointer so you can see. So remember, we've got this orange line up here on the histogram. That's going to tell us where we are on the histogram for any point underneath my mouse. So up here, way overexposed, we know that. Down here, it's in the upper midtones. Up here is in the shadows. Okay. So what about these light streaks? Well, the light streaks should all be in the highlights, right? So I should be able to pick them out in the Luma range and then really enhance them. Well, no, because if I look at this highlight here, this light streak, it's in the upper midtones, almost in the highlights. This light streak goes into the upper midtones, but slightly lower. This light streak here is way into the highlights. This light streak is in the shadows. This light streak here is in the lower midtones. So the light streaks are going everywhere all over the histogram. And the reason is because they light up the background. And the background is obviously changing depending on what we're looking at. So at one point, it's a tree in the background. At one point, it's the sunlight itself. So instead of that, we can't. Let me just show you actually. Let's do a filled layer. And let's choose our Luma range. So let's display our mask and say, okay, so what bit do we want to choose for the light streaks? Well, it's not the highlights. It's not really the midtones. It picks up some of them, but it doesn't pick up any of these. It's definitely not the shadows. So Luma range doesn't help, even though in our heads we're thinking, well, they're light streaks. Yeah, they are, but the effect on the photo isn't uniform. So they don't all sit in the highlights or the shadows or the midtones. Instead, we're going to use clarity. It's that simple. So clarity is great if you remember identifying areas of contrast change and enhancing that. Well, that's exactly what we've got here in front of us. So first thing, high dynamic range, let's pull down the highlights area just to try and get this back in here a little bit. We're not going to be able to get it all back. If I move my mouse over here, look at those numbers at the top, 255 all the way across. It's completely blown out. I don't need to put on my exposure warning to see that. Even if I pull down our exposure, yeah, we get quite a bit of it back, but it's still overblown in some places. So we're going to use our white slider to pull that back a little bit. And we might use our exposure a little bit across the whole image just to pull back some detail in there. With that done, I can now use either curves or levels to pull the rest of it back. So remember, we don't want to touch this upper part here, but we do want to touch this part. So that's the midtone area. So I can use my level slider here, which is affecting the midtones, but that's a kind of an all across blanket effect that I don't really want because it's also going to increase the stuff over here in the trees. So instead, using my mouse across these highlights, I can see where on the curve they sit, and that's why the orange bar is there to help you. So I can see these all sit in this sort of lower 1/4 here, or the second quarter along. Okay, not here, not the trees. Not here, certainly, because that's up in the highlights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place a little dot here and say, leave that stuff alone up here. And I'm going to place a little dot down here and another one there as an anchor. And with these mid parts here in that bottom or second quadrant, we can pull this up slightly, not too much. And we're just going to put a little bump into the curve. So if I do before and after, so there's before, there's after. What we've done effectively is just enhance that streaking just by choosing this area here of the histogram and increasing it. I can't do that with exposure. It's just going to shift the whole thing across left or right. I can't do it with brightness. It's just going to squish it left or right. I can't do it with levels. It's too blunt. But what I can do is with the curve. Now that's on the Luma curve at the moment. Just realize that. Let's switch that. Let's go back to our RGB curve, which might be a little bit safer to do that with as well, because we're getting some weird effect there for a second. So let me just anchor these points in here and raise that up there. You've got to be careful with curves, both RGB and Luma, that you don't get some weird color effects that can creep in. But if I go before and after, you can see how strong those light streaks then become just by putting that little hump in that area of the histogram alone. So not the whole histogram, just that area. Okay, on top of that, so this is my filled adjustment layer, remember, it's applying to all of it. I could take out some of the stuff that I don't want it to apply to. So if I go to my erase tool, turn my mask on, I could, of course, take out some of this stuff. Let me just up the opacity. So we can do there to get rid of all that shadow stuff. And we can take it out of here. Oops. No, we'll leave that in there. That actually enhanced it. I don't want to get rid of that. And we're going to leave that probably there. In fact, I might even undo. Yeah, we'll leave that there because, of course, on this bit, we also did the exposure change. So we'll leave that as it is because I just forgot that we put the exposure change on there already. Because if I now make any change to get rid of that curve effect in there, it's also going to erase it for all of this stuff as well. In theory, I could do it on a separate layer. Learning point, we should have done that in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to call this one light rays, and it's cover all, because it does cover the whole image. Okay, with that cover all image, because I've got it covered all, I'm just going to use our clarity slider and pull that up. Again, not too much. Don't do it too much. But if I now go before and after, we go from here to here. So we've got our strands nicely identified. They're all individual. They're all quite neat, pulled out. Here, there's nothing, again, nothing wrong with the original shot. I like it, but this just feels more warm, more glowing, more sunsetty, and so on. We could even, if we wanted to, push that even warmer into the sunset sort of colors. We could even play with our color balance tool, so our color editor. We could actually go into our, where are we, color editor here. So let's stick with our basic tool and pick on this color here, which is in the reds, and we're just going to up the saturation a little bit into those reds and oranges. And we could also equally pick on our greens up here. Let's just make sure it's on a green. I'll choose the green here manually. And we can pull our lightness down. Again, that's just going to help with that balance between the warm light and the green of the forest. Okay, right, there's our light rays done. So, speaking of light rays, let's go into San Francisco from, I guess, Sausalito somewhere. So again, very small changes in here, and it depends on what you're trying to make the focus of this picture. Personally, I'm tempted to crop some of this stuff out at the bottom, but I haven't played with it yet, so let's have a little play. I'm going to switch my crop to be, let's go 2x3. So it's the original crop dimensions, and see what we get if we pull it. I kind of want to go into there rather than all this foreground. The foreground is fine, but in order to do that, I'm going to switch to a 2x1 again. Let's go up to here, maybe into there. Let's have a look. Bit messy down the bottom. So what I'm looking for is how does that crop affect the bottom of the image? So in other words, when I put a frame or a mat here, do I have any weird extra artifacts that I don't like? One or two we can crop out for sure. But when we've got entire halves of roofs and houses and stuff, it just doesn't feel right. That feels a bit better. And actually, I know these are part of the landscape, but we might actually just heal these two in. So let's go to our exposure slider or exposure tab. Healing brush up here, so a little sticky plaster. Let's go and choose a much smaller brush for a start. Opacity 100%, and there. And new healing brush tool, obviously we can just paint, and Capture One is going to guess where to take that heal from. Doing a pretty good job. There we go. And we've now got a clean edge, and that's what I'm looking for. So it's not necessarily about just the crop, it's about what's on the edges. So this is an example here on the left. When you see that printed against a mat, it's just going to look weird. So we're going to get rid of that, and Capture One has chosen the wrong place to take that from. So I'm just going to tell it, no, take the source from up here, and I just grab it. So you grab the origin point and just move it to where you want it to come from. Okay, so that's a very different crop to what we had before. This we're probably going to darken down, this roof. So let's create a new layer, and I'm going to call it roof. And I'm going to paint over this roof here. And we are going to use a Luma range now. So with our Luma range set, let's just turn on our mask, and I'm going to choose those midtones only. So I don't want to darken everything on the roof. I just want to darken the roof itself and nothing behind it. There we go there. And with that, we're going to pull down our exposure there. So do you see why we've done that? If I look at the wider picture here, look at before, I've got something here that's distracting on the edge. Be really careful with that. By dialing in that Luma range just to darken down the roof, we forget that roof is there. And now the focus is back onto that skyline. Let's just double check. Should have done this before, but let's just double check that we're nice and level with the straighten tool. Not quite, but it's not far off. Okay, looks pretty good. Here, let's try and illuminate this a little bit. So I'm going to put in a little gradient, so a straight gradient tool rather than a radial gradient tool. I'm going to draw that. Oops. Right, learning point. So remember, I already had a mask layer. So when I start using the gradient tool, it's going to overwrite that mask. If I didn't have any other layers, it would create a new gradient mask layer for me. Instead, I have to create a new one. So gradient bottom right. Now if I draw my gradient mask, it's not going to apply to the layer that we were already working on. And with that gradient mask, again, I'm going to pull up shadows. I'm not going to pull up the entire exposure. If I do that, it's going to look weird. So instead, we're pulling up the shadows and we're pulling up the black slider just to get some detail into this foreground. That looks really nice as a lead into the city in the background. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to our city out here. And I'm actually going to draw very quickly with a brush. Sorry, let's create a new layer. I'm going to call it City Skyline. Going to draw really quickly, very roughly, a mask across that skyline. So let's just turn the mask on so you can see there. Okay, again, Luma range. And I'm going to turn on to display the mask. I don't want any highlights. In fact, most of it must sit down there. There we go. So you see how powerful that Luma range is. And I don't want these dark shadows here. So let's just get rid of those and get rid of that just until we don't want the city to start losing some of its mask. So just until the city's all full, but we haven't masked too much of this shadow here, and apply it. Now with that and that skyline, and if we really wanted to be picky, we could spend a little more time. We could refine the edge. We could increase the sensitivity and the radius just to soften the edges so it's not quite so obvious. But with that mask now, I can increase our contrast and our clarity just a touch, just to make that skyline pop. So if we look at without and with, it's just got a bit more presence with more contrast in it. The overall picture, well, let's put in an extra fun little gradient, so sky gradient. I'm not going to change the white balance in this shot. I really like it. It's a really nice set of colors. So sky gradient there, coming in from there, and with that gradient, we're just going to increase a saturation boost a tiny bit and pull down our exposure. Again, just so the sky isn't distracting away from what is here, the lead in here of this little town, out to the skyline across there. Okay, overall, and what I tend to do, this is personal preference, but I would then, if I'm going to do anything overall on top of all of this, do a global adjustment, and it's probably going to be levels in here. And with our levels overall, so remember this mask affects everything on the picture and below. I could do this on the background layer, don't get me wrong. It's just for me, logically, I know that I'm doing it last, so I want to apply it to everything. And with the levels and with our clarity, it just gives it a bit of a pop. Okay, so again, before and after. So here's our before. And there's our after. It's subtle, it's a small change, but it just makes a big difference. If I create a new variant, so this is where we started from. And that to me just feels more like a print. We could look at getting rid of that plane if we want to, so we can go back to our healing layer. It's going to select the healing layer that I was already on. So once I start drawing, you see there, it's automatically selected the heal layer 1 because I already had one. And if we really wanted to, we could heal out that plane, but in the interest of time, we're going to switch to one final quick edit. What's that question? So, Paul, is it possible to have one channel clipping when it comes to printing? Yeah, it is. I mean, ideally you don't want a channel print or clipping, but if red is at 255, the overall, so the reason you'd have red at 255 and RGB at 215 is because the green and the blue channels were much lower than 215, and remember the overall RGB value is the average of the three. So it is telling you that the red is clipping, so be careful with it. But if it prints okay and it's right, then okay. I mean, I've done a picture once with a traffic light. There's a red traffic light in a city, and of course it's saying that the red in the traffic light is 255. Well, of course it is. It's a traffic light. It's red, and it's bright. So take the warnings with a pinch of reality when it comes to looking at your picture and what that warning actually means to the content in your picture. If it prints okay, then you're fine. It's just a warn. It's just a warning. Okay. We will get to other ones later on. Let's just go on to, let's do this one quickly from Ralph. So next time we'll probably cover a lot more cities. So we've got some cityscapes in there. So again, we've got our lens profile loaded in. Again, we could play. Let's have a look at what our color tab for our curve is telling us. So this is auto, linear response. So we get a lot more control over those glowing parts of the bridge. But we also lose a lot of the vividness of the picture. So I'm going to leave it on auto because in this case, I would prefer personally to pull down our highlights and our whites to get that detail back. Just undo that brush. Let's just zoom in here onto the shard. So with that change, we've got our details back, but I haven't had to do too much work to keep how vivid this picture feels. There's quite a lot of keystone correction to do on this picture. So we're going to go into our vertical keystone tool instead of the horizontal one, because we've got the lean in that way. So let's make this line work out correctly along the lines of either Tower Bridge there, or we could actually use the middle of the shard as a line. That looks pretty good through there. This one's a bit more difficult, but if we find a rough line, that's the reason why you've got the dotted lines here. So a rough line along here, let's go there and there. That might be a bit too far, but we'll see when I click the button. Hit apply. Actually, pretty good. Not bad at all. Okay, so let's keep our original crop, and I'm just going to move it down slightly so we don't lose the tail of this statue here. Let's go to there. So we've got the bridge nicely on this 1/3 line here on the right. We've got the statue coming out of that bottom 1/3 line. Here, remember when you're doing your keystone, the default on Keystone, let's just go back to our Keystone tool here, which is under the Lens tab, is to only do it to 80%. So whatever you dial in, it doesn't do it to 100. Long discussions about that one, but in general, set it to 100 if you're doing any architecture stuff. If anything on here, we could probably afford to have that pulled a little bit straighter there. That's looking good there. Okay, so now we've got our tower bridge all set. Let's do a quick heal of these big, they're either rain spots or dust spots, we'll see. So again, I don't have a heal layer. It's because I don't. Capture One is going to create one automatically for me when I start clicking. So there, I think these are probably rain spots. Either that, whose is this? It's Ralph. So either that or Ralph, you really need to clean your lens or sensor. There's one there that we could spend a little bit more time. Okay, so then we've got to look at what do we want to do to the picture. Well, the white balance is okay. I'm sort of tempted to cool it a little bit more and also adjust that tint just to about there, just to keep it really cold. This concrete here of Tower Bridge is actually quite a solid neutral grey. So let's keep that nice and grey. We could even use the picker off of this bridge, but bear in mind when I do that, remember that the bridge is being lit by light, and the light on here is actually quite warm. So you don't quite get the cool effect of that natural grey. So if you've got something that's grey in the picture, use that as a reference to your eye. Use the picker, the dropper, by all means to get the auto white balance done. But just be aware that it's going to be affected by the light that's hitting that neutral substance. So just use your eye a little bit and make sure that it's correct. Up here with this statue, well, let's think about what we want to affect. Look at my histogram. So as I'm moving here, it's all in those darkest tones, the shadows and the blacks. This sky isn't. It's in the mid-tones. This sky isn't. So what we can do here is let's draw a new gradient. So because I don't have a gradient layer, it's going to automatically create a new one, an adjustment layer. And with that gradient, I could then pull up the shadows only in this section here. So it doesn't affect any of here. That looks pretty nice. We've got a little bit more focus in there. Cool. We could, on our overall picture, let's pull up some clarity a little bit. So clarity in a city especially gives you a little bit of pop. It just makes that city look a bit more vibrant, a little more exciting. We've got some nice sharpness in here, but I'm going to dial in a touch of structure. And the reason I am is because I want all this texture on the brickwork and all this tile and everything to come out. And that's where structure comes into its own, because it's focusing on details. Up here, I've just noticed there's some other little drops that we need to get rid of with our healing tool. Cool, that doesn't look too bad. But yeah, we need to look at some cleaning on the lens or on the sensor. And from there, that's probably where I'd leave it on this one. I don't want to pull up the shadows over here because that's just going to be a little bit grungy. It's the base of the bridge with all the seaweed. It's a nice cityscape shot. Effectively, what I could do is just pull up brightness a touch. So remember, brightness is going to not hurt the highlights as much as exposure. And then I could pull down our highlights a bit more as well, just to correct those lights there. So then we go again. So here's our before. Again, nothing wrong with the shot. But here's our after, and it just feels more vibrant. It feels more like a city. It feels more vivid. And that's what we really want to go for with cityscapes, especially at night when you've got the lights and everything, the light trails. Okay, that's it for today, for Monday. So, good to see you all. Although I can't see you, that's a bit of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Hopefully we've got the feed issue sorted. So if you do have a problem where you're seeing sort of blurry stuff on here, it's probably the compression that's happening on something like Facebook or your browser. Try switching to Chrome, try switching from Facebook into YouTube. All of those things can help. But we send it out, I think, at 2560 resolution wide, so it should be pretty sharp. If it's not, then there's something going wrong. So actually, right thing to do, let us know, and hopefully we can get there as a group. Okay, so next session, I can't, to be honest, remember exactly when it is, but it will be posted in the Facebook group. So if you're not in there, join it. We'll put it in there. It's also on our Facebook page. It's also on YouTube. It's also on our website. So check out when we're next on. I think it will be next week sometime. Remember, we've also got those pro tips things. So the pro tips will go into a specific topic such as brightness and exposure and clarity and so on. And you can learn that in sort of 15-20 minutes each time. They're quite nice and bite-sized. I'm running out of breath. And finally, make sure that if you want your picture to be picked up on one of these sessions, then put it into the upload tool, so paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. Upload it there. Make sure you tell us your name. Make sure you send us a RAW file, not a JPEG or a TIFF, and we will try and feature you next time. In the meantime, we will catch you later, or catch you next week, and hope you're all safe, and we'll catch you next time around. Cheers, bye.